of 5 October 24, 1929, a date forever etched in the annals of economic calamity, Black Thursday. In the span of just 6 harrowing hours, Americans watched as $14 billion vanished into thin air. To put that into perspective, the sum lost that frantic day dwarfed the entire economic output of Canada at the time. The trading floor of the New York Stock Exchange was inundated with despair. 13 million shares flooded the market, flooding in a cascade of panic selling unprecedented in scale. Phone lines buzzed, rang, and then fell silent, cut off by sheer overload. Communication with the very heart of American finance ground to a halt. Yet, buried beneath the chaos, there lies a story often overshadowed. The quiet ripple of a decision by a single man, a man heralded by contemporary newspapers as Sunshine Charlie, America's golden banker, the prodigal son of Wall Street. That man was Charles E. Mitchell. He stands as the unlikely architect behind what the world would come to know as the Great Depression, a crisis that spiraled beyond markets and seized the fate of an entire generation. But unlike the faceless forces of economics and history, this collapse stemmed from one pivotal phrase uttered 7 months earlier, a phrase intended as a balm, but which instead ignited the fuse of the most devastating economic crash in human history. The Great Depression did not merely disrupt markets, it tore at the very fabric of American life. Over the next 10 years, its shadow would lengthen across every corner of the nation. 25 million Americans, 1 in every 4, found themselves stripped of jobs. 5,000 banks collapsed like dominoes, swallowing the life savings of millions of families who had placed their trust in institutions that promised security. 2 million people were uprooted, driven to homelessness in tent cities bitterly christened Hoovervilles, scrawled on the margins of American dignity. Suicide rates climbed by 30%, voices silenced by the crushing weight of despair. Breadlines stretched through cities that had once stood as beacons of prosperity and hope. How did this catastrophe come to pass? What undercurrents pulled the rug from beneath the world's wealthiest nation? To understand, we must journey to the 1920s, an era baptized the Roaring Twenties, a golden age bursting with the promise of endless prosperity. It was a time when the hum of Henry Ford's assembly lines seemed to echo the boundless growth of American industry. Radios crackled in every household, jazz spilled from smoky clubs, and skyscrapers thrust into the heavens as symbols of unyielding progress. The nation's wealth swelled, optimism reigned supreme. Yet beneath this glittering veneer, seeds of fragility were being sown. And at the center of this maelstrom of growth and greed, a man emerged whose vision would irrevocably reshape American finance. Charles Edwin Mitchell was born in 1877, the son of a modest Massachusetts farmer. At first glance, he was a son of plain means, with nothing that foretold the meteoric rise that awaited him. But by 1919, he had become the president of National City Bank, then America's largest bank, boasting assets totaling an astonishing $2.7 billion. To grasp that magnitude, consider that many nations at the time managed smaller budgets. But Mitchell was not content merely to steward immense capital. He harbored an idea revolutionary in scope and perilous in consequence. To break down the exclusive walls of Wall Street and bring the stock market within reach of the everyday American. To the elites of finance, stocks had long been a closed society, a playground for the wealthy and powerful. 500,000 Americans, less than 1% of the population, owned shares, relegating the stock market to the realm of private clubs and gilded parlors. The average citizen's financial world revolved around savings accounts and bonds, safe, dull, but dependable. Mitchell dared to envision something radically different, democracy through capitalism. Every American should be a capitalist, he declared. Why should wealth be locked behind the doors of the few, he asked, when the promise of the market could be shared by all? In 1920, Mitchell launched the National City Company, a subsidiary designed to bring stocks into bank branches across the country. The decision was as bold as it was unprecedented. When ordinary Americans came to open savings accounts, they were now offered more than just safety. They were lured into a new possibility, ownership of the American dream itself. This was no mere financial transaction. Mitchell transformed stock selling into a finely honed art, engineering every aspect to tap into human ambition and desire. His salespeople were not mere clerks but dream merchants, stationed in 69 branches nationwide, trained in a specialized program that combined sales psychology with a profound understanding of hope and greed. Advertising blitzed the nation. Newspaper headlines flashed promises: get rich with only $15 a month. Become a partner in American Telephone and Telegraph. Your children will be proud of you. You're an investor. Magazines bore stories of seemingly ordinary people transformed. A secretary in Ohio who became wealthy in 2 years. A streetcar driver who bought his own home with dividends. Sales pitches painted vivid pictures, designed to appeal to identity and aspiration. Mr. Johnson, a salesman might say, you don't want to spend your life working for someone else, do you? Buy General Electric stocks. Here's your chance to be the master of your own destiny. Or, Mrs. Smith, your husband works for Ford Motors. Why not become a co-owner of the company? The offices themselves were theatrical stages. Posters glowed with images of happy families standing before big houses, luxury cars parked nearby, smiling children playing in the sunlight. Thanks to stocks, we bought our dream home, they declared. It was a narrative not just of money, but of identity, hope wrapped in the language of ownership, participation, and the promise that anyone could rise. But the true stroke of genius, and ultimately the fatal flaw, lay in the ingenuity of credit. Stocks could be bought on margin, with only 10% of your own cash up front. The bank lent the remaining 90%. Imagine it. With $100, you could control $1,000 worth of stocks. If prices rose by 20%, your $100 investment would yield you $200 in profits, a staggering 200% return. The sales teams wielded simple but persuasive arithmetic. Look, Mr. Brown, they might say, bought stocks of Radio Corporation for $500, investing only $50 of his own. 6 months later, those stocks increased $150 in value, 300% profit. Meanwhile, your money in the bank would have earned a modest $15. The message was clear. Buy now, multiply your money at an exponential rate. The results were staggering. Between 1925 and 1929, loans for purchasing stocks ballooned from $2 billion to $8.5 billion, a 425% surge in just 4 years. The number of Americans owning stocks exploded from 500,000 to nearly 10 million. People mortgaged homes, sold livestock, and invested entire salaries with an unshakable belief in unfettered ascent. It was a time of both extraordinary prosperity and profound naivete. A teacher in Ohio mortgaged her house to buy Radio Corporation stock. A Kansas farmer sold his cattle to invest in General Motors. A Detroit mechanic poured 6 months' salary into Ford shares. 1 million private fortunes were being minted on paper, fueled by cheap credit and unyielding faith. Mitchell basked in the glow of this unprecedented success. The press lauded him as a financial visionary, the great democratizer of Wall Street. In 1928 alone, Mitchell pocketed $1.2 million, more than $20 million in today's dollars. His name appeared on magazine covers, the man who purportedly brought the dream of capitalism to the masses. Yet beneath the bright headlines, a darker truth was taking shape, a labyrinth of credit and leverage that threatened to spiral beyond control. T-I-BFP-5C. But this financial genius, Charles E. Mitchell, was not merely an architect of prosperity. He was, unwittingly, the harbinger of disaster. The promise of democratized capitalism, laced with credit and speculation, was becoming a powder keg. The widespread margin buying was a mechanism that amplified not just profits but losses, setting the stage for catastrophic reversal. As stock prices soared to dizzying heights, the illusion of endless wealth took hold. Banks and brokers, driven by booming commissions and the thrill of the market, increasingly tolerated risk that in any sober moment would have been deemed reckless. Banks like National City Bank, the very institution Mitchell led, were themselves deeply entwined, their balance sheets bolstered by loans extended both to investors and corporations, creating a feedback loop of speculation and credit expansion. Amidst this heady atmosphere, regulators and economists sounded faint alarms. The Federal Reserve, wary of inflation and excessive speculation, raised interest rates intermittently, attempting to curb the market's overheating. But these modest efforts were overwhelmed by the tidal wave of optimism and reckless debt. The public, intoxicated by the roaring market, shrugged off warnings. For many, the market was not just an investment, it was the embodiment of American destiny itself. The psychology of the era was as potent as the mechanics of finance. Wealth was no longer just measured in dollars, it was measured in identity, status, and hope. To be outside the market was to risk being excluded from the American dream. Stock prices were buoyed not simply by fundamentals, but by a collective belief in inevitable growth, driven by the cultural narrative Mitchell had so masterfully propagated. Yet, beneath this veneer, subtle cracks were appearing. Corporate earnings showed signs of stagnation, industrial production growth began to slow. Income inequality, the very problem that Mitchell sought to combat by expanding stock ownership, remained stark. The top 0.1% commanded nearly half of all corporate equity. The vast majority of Americans, despite owning stocks on paper, lived paycheck to paycheck, exposed and vulnerable if the bubble burst. Then, quietly in early 1929, Mitchell made his critical statement. Addressing a banking conference in March, he declared that the stock market was in no way overheated, dismissing rumors of a speculative bubble. His words were widely reported and widely believed. For many, his affirmation became a tacit seal of approval, a signal that the party could continue unchecked. But this was the moment the fuse was lit. As summer gave way to fall, trading volumes ballooned further, and margin loans reached perilous levels. The undercurrent of risk grew with each passing day. Banks extended credit not just to individual investors but speculators who borrowed to buy more stock, who then pledged those stocks again as collateral, the financial equivalent of a house of mirrors. A single default could start a chain reaction. When prices began to falter in late October, the unraveling was swift. Margin calls cascaded through the market like falling dominoes. Investors, many of whom had gambled everything, scrambled to liquidate their holdings to cover debts. The flood of selling overwhelmed the market, crushing prices further and feeding a spiraling panic. This delirium on Wall Street was more than a market crash, it was a rupture in the social contract. Families who had bought into an optimistic vision now faced ruin. Banks that had once seemed impregnable teetered on collapse, threatening the savings and livelihoods of millions. The invisible hand of the market was becoming an iron fist gripping the country's soul. Mitchell, once hailed as Sunshine Charlie, became a figure of controversy and blame. Was he a reckless gambler, a visionary betrayed by forces beyond his control, or the embodiment of a dangerous hubris? The truth is complex. He was both a catalyst and a symptom, a man who wielded immense power, but could not control the tempest he unleashed. In the years that followed, as the economic dust settled, scholars and survivors alike grappled with the moral dimensions of the crash. The democratization of capitalism, once a laudable goal, was revealed as a double-edged sword. Ownership without understanding, credit without restraint, hope without caution had combined into a ruinous force. This tragic era forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about human nature and finance. How fragile is the architecture of prosperity when built on borrowed dreams? How quickly does optimism turn into desperation when the foundations give way? And what role do powerful individuals play when their visions reshape societies for better or worse? As the nation plunged into darkness, the legacy of Charles E. Mitchell and his grand experiment stood as a stark warning. The Great Depression was not just an economic event, it was a story of ambition, faith, and the perilous edge of American capitalism. But even in catastrophe, history often reveals the faint outlines of redemption and reform. The next, as the dust begins to settle, will expose how the crash transformed the financial world, forever ushering in regulations, institutions, and guarded hope. And yet, as we peer back, the shadows of 1929 still whisper a haunting question. Have we truly learned to contain the ambitions that once ignited this descent? But credit, by its very nature, is a double-edged sword. What lifts fortunes on the way up can shatter them just as brutally on the way down. By 1929, the very system Mitchell had orchestrated was a house of cards, built as much on borrowed hope as borrowed money. Banks like National City had loaded their ledgers with hundreds of millions in margin loans, converting everyday citizens into collateral for Wall Street's speculative frenzy. This was not the democratization of capitalism. This was a perilous gamble, veiled beneath a facade of civic progress. What Mitchell overlooked, or perhaps willfully ignored, was the fragility of this economic pyramid. The market's exponential climb was disconnected from the American economy's real productivity. Growth in industrial output stalled while stock prices soared. Dividends did not keep pace with share valuations. The average employee's wage gains were modest compared to the explosive rise in corporate profits on paper. The majority of Americans remained consumers, not participants, burdened by debt that was barely sustainable. Ironically, Mitchell's effort to bring Wall Street to Main Street exposed millions to a financial tidal wave they were neither prepared for nor fully informed about. The cultural narrative of easy wealth drowned out skeptics who warned of instability. Financial journalism largely echoed the exuberance, or was muzzled by advertising dollars from bank-led stock campaigns. Regulators, still adjusting to the new financial era, watched ineffectively as credit clawed inexorably skyward. The Federal Reserve did raise interest rates in early 1929, sensing overheating, but their measures came too late and were half-hearted. Even more worrisome was the systemic risk now embedded deep within the banking sector itself. Banks not only lent money to investors, but had started investing their own capital heavily into the market, encouraged by the same optimism they had fostered in the public. The line between lender and speculator blurred. When stock prices faltered, banks faced catastrophic losses, threatening the entire financial infrastructure. On the surface, the Roaring Twenties still shimmered with glamour. Headlines celebrated astronomical stock gains, parties raged in Manhattan penthouses, automobiles flooded the highways. But beneath this glittering veneer, the American economy was becoming a precarious creature of illusions. The iconic skyscrapers that punctuated city skylines were monuments not just to industrial progress, but also to the hubris of an era intoxicated by credit and suspicion of limits. Then came September and October of 1929. Murmurs of caution began to surface, whispers of market overvaluation and unsustainable corporate earnings. Mitchell himself faced mounting criticism. Some questioned the integrity of National City's risky lending practices, yet his public statements remained bullish, shimmering with confidence and reassurance. The phrase he uttered 7 months before Black Thursday, one that was intended to calm anxieties and stabilize markets, would instead send shockwaves into the very heart of the economy. The moment Mitchell declared that the market had reached a new plateau and that prices will not decline in any material degree was a turning point. Instead of a balm, this became an ignition. Investors, heavily leveraged and believing the ascent was eternal, scrambled to hold onto inflated paper wealth. When prices began to dip, the domino effect was brutal and inexorable. For millions who had bet their lives, mortgages, savings, livelihoods on Mitchell's vision, the collapse was not an abstract crash but an apocalyptic unmaking. The dream of ownership crumbled overnight. Families lost everything. Trust in the institutions that had promised growth was shattered irrevocably. Yet, in the ruins of this financial apocalypse lies a more profound question. How does a society reconcile the pursuit of wealth, with all its dreams and perils, against the brutal consequences of collective risk? Mitchell was more than a man. He was a symbol of ambition unchecked by caution, of hope weaponized through credit, and of a vision that blurred the line between empowerment and exploitation. As the world plunged into darkness, the legacy of Charles E. Mitchell would be dissected in courtrooms, congressional hearings, and history itself. But the true cost was paid not in dollars alone, but in the shattered hopes of a generation. The Great Depression would reshape politics, culture, and economics forever, a stark reminder that prosperity built on leverage can bake instability into the very DNA of a nation. And yet, the final question lingers. Could this catastrophe have been avoided? Or was the crash an inevitable reckoning for an era that demanded progress at any cost? The echoes of this dilemma reverberate through modern finance, haunting every bubble and bust. What followed in the months after Black Thursday would reveal not only the fragility of financial markets, but the resilience and flaws of American society itself. The battle to emerge from the abyss would redefine the very notion of capitalism and democracy. But before that dawn, the darkness deepened. But the dazzling rise of stock ownership, underpinned by loans and margin buying, was not merely a tale of booming markets and widespread prosperity. It was a precarious house of cards. Banks like National City were not just facilitators. They were active participants in fueling this speculative mania. Mitchell's vision had catalyzed a seismic shift in the relationship between everyday Americans and the financial system, but the enthusiasm outpaced prudence in ways few seemed willing or able to grasp. Behind the scenes, the structure of this newfound, democratized capitalism was brittle. The mechanism of buying on margin hinged on the assumption that stock prices would only rise, an assumption that ignored the volatile pulse beneath the market's surface. While investors saw stocks as tickets to wealth, banks had bundled this feverish optimism into an immense accumulation of risk. Margin loans were, in essence, bets against the future, loans that expected continuous upward trajectories in value and the never-ending appetite of buyers. What few appreciated was the cascading effect that would ensue if confidence faltered. Should prices drop, even slightly, margin calls would force investors to liquidate their holdings, causing prices to fall even further, a self-feeding spiral of panic selling. The system was a tightrope stretched over a chasm. One misstep, and the fall would be catastrophic. Perhaps the most striking irony lay in the very ethos Mitchell championed, the belief that capitalism could be a participatory force for all citizens. The ideal was noble, to share prosperity, to bridge the yawning divide between Wall Street's gilded elites and Main Street's hardworking families. Yet this expansion of access came at a grave cost. By wrapping the dangerous wager of speculation in the language of opportunity and inclusion, a vast population was swept into a collective gamble, without the safety nets or financial literacy to understand the full magnitude of their exposure. As 1929 progressed, troubling signs began to emerge. Production in key industries like railroads and coal mining slowed, agricultural prices plunged, strangling rural incomes, and wage growth stagnated even as stock prices soared. These warning signals were drowned out by the euphoric headlines that continued to paint a picture of unbroken advance. Credit kept flowing, and with it, the illusion that wealth was just a stock certificate away. In September, the market reached dizzying heights. Yet beneath the surface, major institutional investors grew wary. Aggregate debt was ballooning. Insider trading and manipulative schemes proliferated, camouflaged by the flood of new retail investors. Banks, including National City, into which Mitchell had poured so much ambition and influence, were stretching reserves perilously thin. This borrowed time could not last. Then, on a blistering October day, the fragile edifice began to crack. The initial sharp drop on October 24 was only the first tremor. The liquidity dried up as margin calls cascaded, and those same dream merchants who had coaxed millions into the market now begged desperately to stem the hemorrhaging. The National City Bank, a titan under Mitchell's stewardship, found itself ensnared in the wreckage it had helped create. Its own balance sheets, inflated by risky loans tied to inflated stock prices, were jeopardized by the panic. Mitchell's role in this unraveling was complex. His charisma and vision had inspired a mass movement of participation and investment, but his recklessness in underwriting credit expansion and blurring the lines between banking and speculative enterprise laid the groundwork for disaster. Far from being a mere victim of circumstance, he was an active agent in pushing an economy teetering on excess toward the brink. The crash exposed the fragility of an economy built on borrowed money and collective hope. It revealed how intertwined ordinary lives had become with the invisible forces of financial engineering, how quickly dreams can sour and ripple into despair. The Great Depression was no accident. It was a predictable consequence of an unchecked gamble that mobilized millions while masking its peril behind slogans and numbers. In that breakdown, the nation faced a question far deeper than economic metrics or stock prices. What is the cost of democratizing risk? Can the promise of shared prosperity be sustained without safeguards, or is it inherently unstable when the weight of debt overloads the people it seeks to empower? As the dust settled and America plunged into a decade of hardship, Charles E. Mitchell faded from glory, a man both lionized and blamed. His legacy was a complex tapestry of ambition, innovation, and hubris, reflecting the contradictions of an era that dreamed too big and bet too recklessly. Yet the story was far from over. The collapse of the stock market was merely the opening act of a global economic tragedy that would redefine governments, societies, and the very idea of capitalism itself. In the shadows of bankruptcy courts and welfare lines, new powers would rise, new regulations would be forged, and the idea of what capitalism meant to the everyday citizen would be forever altered. The question lingered. Could an economy survive when the foundations of trust, between lender and borrower, banker and depositor, were shattered? And more hauntingly, what new architecture of finance might emerge from the rubble? But the final and fatal piece in this intricate puzzle was yet to fall into place. By mid-1929, the stock market was no longer a reflection of underlying economic growth. It had mutated into a casino fueled by borrowed money and blind speculation. The ratio of margin debt to actual cash investments had reached perilous heights. Brokers, emboldened by the chorus of rising prices, extended credit recklessly, offering loans to anyone willing to sign on the dotted line, regardless of their ability to repay. At the heart of this unsustainable frenzy stood Charles Mitchell, whose confidence in perpetual prosperity bordered on hubris. In a meeting that summer, Mitchell famously assured the public that a crash has been artificially created and can be undone by intelligent action. His words were broadcast widely, interpreted as a promise that the bank, and by extension, the financial system, would curb excesses and stabilize markets. Investors took this as a beacon of hope, doubling down on their stock purchases even as the market trembled beneath them. Yet Mitchell's intelligent action was paradoxical. Instead of reining in risky borrowing, National City Bank deepened its involvement, extending more credit to speculators. The institution's financial statements grew ever more opaque, mixing high-risk margin loans with traditional deposits. Behind closed doors, some bank executives whispered warnings about the alchemy of leverage, but their cautions were drowned by a culture enamored with expansion and profit. This was a festering storm beneath a shiny facade. The very institutions entrusted with safeguarding the nation's wealth were entangled in the speculative web. Banks themselves had become stock market gamblers, their solvency tied to the fickle tides of share prices. The fragile balance between confidence and collapse resembled a high-wire act without a safety net. By September, subtle tremors began to ripple through the market. Corporate earnings failed to keep pace with soaring stock valuations. Analysts questioned whether this dizzying ascent was sustainable. Margin calls, that ominous demand for additional cash to cover loans, started to unsettle investors. Yet the prevailing narrative remained defiant. Optimism masked the first signs of underlying rot, as if collective denial had become the new currency. The juxtaposition was stark. On the surface, America basked in its roaring 20s glow, flappers danced, jazz clubs thrived, and skyscrapers pierced the skies. Yet beneath that jazz-age revelry, everyday Americans clung to borrowed dreams. The teacher who mortgaged her home, the farmer who sold cattle, the mechanic who poured months of wages into stocks, all were betting on an endless upward trajectory. This collective gamble was more than financial recklessness. It was a mirror to the human condition, the intoxicating lure of hope amid uncertainty. Mitchell's promise of democratized capitalism had empowered millions, But it also opened the door to a dangerous illusion. That risk had been tamed, that the market was an endless conveyor belt to wealth. But risk was very real, and the market's pendulum was about to swing with devastating force. On October 21st and 22nd, tentative attempts to stabilize the market faltered. Volumes surged, prices wobbled. By October 23rd, Black Wednesday, the selling accelerated. Margin calls flooded brokers. Panic whispered through the corridors of Wall Street. And then, on October 24th, the infamous Black Thursday shattered any remaining veneer of calm. What followed was not just a market crash. It was a tectonic shift in the relationship between the American people and their financial system. The dream that Mitchell had sold revealed its darker undercurrents. What price, after all, does a society pay when hope is banked on borrowed money and unchecked ambition? As the dust settled on that October day, the question that loomed was more profound than market numbers. Could the nation salvage its shattered trust, repair its broken promises, and rise from the ashes of a perfect storm crafted not by faceless economic forces, but by a man's vision twisted by human frailty? The answer would unfold in the years to come, in a struggle that would redefine economics, politics, and the very soul of America. And yet, behind the headlines and the heartbreak, a deeper narrative remained, a tale of power, influence, and the fragile balance between innovation and destruction. What was the true cost of bringing Wall Street to Main Street? How did the democratization of finance become a harbinger of despair? In the shadows of October 1929, the stage was set for a reckoning that would echo through generations,